Hello, welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and this is where I am reading through the enormous library of books that you see behind me, and then I give you a quick synopsis and tell you what I think about them. So if you like books and just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos, and let me know what you think in the comments. Now, at the end of this month is the Libertarian National Convention, so I am looking this month at some of the thought leaders of the libertarian movement, starting with this week's book, Freedom's Furies. Wow, that is also a very, there you can kind of see the full title there. It's Freedom's Furies. How Isabel Paterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand found liberty in an age of darkness by Timothy Sandefur. And since Paterson preferred the term aviation generation over lost generation to describe her generation, this week's cocktail is a classic aviation, which is 2 ounces of gin, a ½ ounce of maraschino liqueur, or in my case, I think I just went with cherry liqueur because that's what I had on hand, a ¼ ounce of Creme de Violette, 3/4 ounce lemon juice, and garnish with a brandied cherry, or in my case, maraschino cherry, since I don't have any brandied cherries. So, let's do this. Now, Freedom's Furies is a brief biography of each of the ladies and covers which life experiences led them to develop, each on their own, their philosophies of individualism and freedom, liberty for all, what brought them to classical liberalism. And those philosophies led to the creation of the Libertarian Party, and one of Lane's proteges, Roger MacBride, would be the second presidential candidate the Libertarian Party would field in 1976. That's in the future and not where our story starts. So let's start with our story. So Isabel Paterson was kind of the linchpin that the other two ladies revolved around. And the reason for that is she wrote a book column, and so that was the what brought them all together, is they each, Lane and Rand, each reached out to her in their own time because she wrote a book column and they wanted to connect with her. So we're going to start with Isabel Paterson, who was born Isabel Mary Bowler on January 22nd, 1886 in Canada. She would eventually immigrate to the Western Canadian Plains with her parents before moving into the United States. She married Kenneth Paterson in 1910, but they separated after a few weeks. It wasn't a very long marriage, and he died sometime not too long after that. Since they never divorced, she just kept his name when she moved to Spokane, Washington, and began writing editorials for various papers, which she signed with her initials, IMP, IMP. It's very appropriate. And in 1912, she moved to New York, where she was horrified by the measures Wilson implemented as the country moved into war in 1916. So she really does start all of this off. Let me say ½ ounce of cherry liqueur. By 1924, Paterson was hired to write a weekly column. You know, I think in the book it said 1922, but then he has a very helpful timeline at the back where he said 1924, so I don't know. But sometime between 22 and 24, she was hired to write a weekly column, Turns with the Bookworm. First, it was with the New York Tribune, which merged a year later with another paper, which became the Herald Tribune. And she would write a weekly column for that paper from either 22 or 24 until her last column was published on January 30th, 1949. So it was a good long while, right? Like 25 years or so. Thousands of columns. ½ ounce cherry liqueur. This column was less of a book review. I mean, she certainly discussed books. Her thoughts on literature were there. It was more kind of a stream of consciousness connecting various works of literature with what was going on in the world. And it was through her column that she would meet and befriend Rose Wilder Lane. Now, Rose Wilder Lane is probably better known to most of us than we realize. She was born December 5th, 1886 in De Smet, Dakota Territory, to Almanzo Wilder and Laura Ingalls Wilder. So, yes, if you were a fan of Little House on the Prairie books or TV series, Rose is the daughter mentioned in the final book of that series, and was she in the show? I don't remember if she was in the show. I'm assuming she was because I know they had children in the show. The final book of the series was the first 4 years and would be instrumental in assisting her mother to write those stories. That's also in the future as far as this book is concerned. Now, after leaving De Smet, the Wilders moved quite a bit, actually. They went to Florida, back to De Smet. They lived in Minnesota, I think, for a while, before they eventually settled in Mansfield, Missouri, and that's more or less where Rose grew up, although she spent some time with an aunt in Louisiana, which is where she graduated from high school. And while she was undeniably intelligent, I mean, she crammed 3 years of Latin into like 1 year and managed to graduate top of her class. Her parents just didn't have the money for her to go to college. Hang on, I have to eyeball this when I don't have the quarter marker on this cup. And the little shot glasses I had that had all the measurements nicely lined out for me, the measurements washed away in the dishwasher. They were not a permanent etching, apparently. Unlike this one, which is quite permanently etched. I've been using it for 2 years now. Let's see if this actually works. Allegedly. Nope, it don't. You know why? Because, well, maybe I have to poke a hole in it and not just stab it. I don't know. I'm going to squish it like this. This I know will work. Lemon juice everywhere. Allegedly, if you poke a hole in the lemon, you can just, like, juice it from the hole in the lemon. I don't know. I probably did it wrong. I didn't poke a hole. I stabbed it. So, you know, it's fine. Whatever. I have a knife. I just cut it in half and squeeze the old-fashioned way. Made a mess, but it's delicious. After she graduated high school, so it took her, you know, like 5 years later, 4 years later. By 1908, she was living in San Francisco, where she met and married her husband, Claire Gillette Lane, in 1909. The couple traveled all over the country, chasing various schemes of Claire Lane's, and I mean, you can kind of see that in some of her literature. You're pretty sure that she's talking about her husband, until Rose eventually gave birth to a stillborn son, and that birth required a surgery that left her unable to bear additional children, and that would kind of haunt her for the rest of life. She would informally adopt multiple people over the course of her life, and help them out, because she couldn't have any kids of her own, so she just started adopting young people in need. And, you know, God bless her for it. That's good for her. Let me shake this up. So the marriage failed not long after that. Not unusual. I mean, not unusual in these times. It actually was kind of unusual back then. Usually you just picked yourself up and kept moving on and stayed married. But I get the feeling Claire was not a good guy. You know, she kind of fell for the ne'er-do-well. And so after their divorce failed, she went to Europe. And she traveled through Europe. While she was in Paris, she befriended Dorothy Thompson? Dorothy Thompson, right? Yeah, Dorothy Thompson, who would later go on to marry Sinclair Lewis. This actually is relevant because Lewis was the premier author of a literary movement that was called Revolt from the Village, which was kind of characterized by sort of this ennui against small-town life and the conformity found therein. Lewis's book Main Street was initially an inspiration for both Paterson and Lane, although Lane would eventually rethink her take on Main Street and write her own homage to the small town with Old Hometown. In the early 1920s, though, after her marriage failed, she traveled through Europe. She went to Albania, and by 1921, that's where she had set up shop. And she fell in love with the country. And one of her, adoptees was a young Albanian guy that she would send money to the rest of her life. I think he was Muslim, actually, because I think Lane was actually one of the starts of the spiritual but not religious movement. She believed there was a higher power. She believed in God, but wasn't really a Christian per se. In fact, none of the three ladies were Christian, although Paterson and Lane both believed in God as a moving force. So the author actually points out that Lane was basically the first, and to date I think only libertarian, to try to bring together Islam with libertarianism and freedom. So that's kind of an interesting take. I appreciate the open-mindedness. Where was I? Okay. In 1928, Laura would summon Rose home, and Rose would not return to Albania because, of course, in 1929, the stock market had crashed, and she was pulled into the Great Depression and the political movement that heralded the death of individualism, aka the New Deal. Well, that's delightful. That is delightful. Now, it was during the Depression that Rose would help Laura write her Little House series, and the author of this book, Sandefur, did an absolutely masterful job pulling out the sections from the individual books that really spoke to the pioneer mindset that Rose inherited. She inherited, and it turned into her contribution to individualism philosophy, basically. She got that. She started out by reading her mother's biography, actually, Pioneer Girl, and then realized that would be an outstanding children's series if edited down and changing the scary bits to be not as scary and rather showing the spirit of individualism, the stick-to-itiveness, that can-do attitude that made America. And they resonate. I mean, hell, they still resonate, right? God, you can still catch Little House on the Prairie on TV. And actually, at this point, I want to just send a quick shout out to my parents here. My mom for reading me the Little House series until I got old enough to steal the entire series from her. She ended up having to buy another one for the granddaughters. I actually still have them. They're boxed up in my attic because the covers are falling off. I read them so much. And Sandefur mentions in here, and this actually made me laugh, that while Laura disliked fiction, Rose liked it fine, and among her favorite authors were Ray Bradbury and Robert Heinlein. So shout out to my dad who read me Heinlein when I was a kid, and when I read that, I actually realized that with those two literary influences in my young life, you know, Laura Ingalls Wilder and Robert Heinlein, I basically had no chance at being anything other than an anarcho-capitalist libertarian douchebag as an adult. Is anybody surprised? Back to the third Fury, Anne Rand. So Rand was born Elisa Rosenbaum on February 2nd, 1905 in St. Petersburg, Russia. And her family was a fairly wealthy Jewish family. They were very bourgeois. She was the oldest of three girls and was certainly old enough to remember the Bolshevik Revolution and the absolute horrors and shit show that Lenin and Stalin were inflicting on Russia in the aftermath. She did receive a college education in Russia, but was basically unable to secure work under the increasingly repressive regime. So in 1925, the family secured what they knew would be a one-way ticket for her to visit extended family in Chicago. And she hopped the plane to America and never looked back, working as a playwright, screenwriter, and novelist in America, working on her own philosophical ideas. She became friendly with first Paterson and then Lane. So the three ladies did know each other, and they exchanged letters until their friendships fell apart. In the case of Paterson, her own irascibility drove Lane and Rand away. And in the case of Lane and Rand, Lane just really could not reconcile herself to Rand's atheism. Paterson would... Basically, she would find what was a weakness, if you will, and then just nick at it and pick at it until the person couldn't take it anymore and left. So in the case of Lane, it was most likely that in her youth she had flirted with communism. And Paterson just thought that anybody who ever thought communism was a good idea was too stupid for words. And that eventually drove them apart. And what did she do with Rand? I don't remember. I get the sense from reading this that what drove them apart ultimately is that Paterson's, while she was a very accomplished columnist with Turns with the Bookworm, her own novels didn't sell as well, and I feel like she was professionally jealous of Rand. That's just kind of a sense I get. And maybe she was professionally jealous of Lane too, because Lane also had some fairly successful novels, and Paterson's never really took off. For about 15 years, there was this great deal of overlap, and the ladies shared ideas and bolstered each other's writing careers. All through the 1930s and all through the 1930s and 40s, frankly, is when they were friends. They were really active with each other. I still have like lemon juice all over me. My hands are sticky. Okay, so they were very active in contributing to each other's careers. And in 1943, each of them published a book for which each would garner a fair amount of fame in their own time, including Paterson, all of which are considered classic libertarian literature. So Isabel Paterson's contribution was called The God and the Machine, and is a manifesto in which she explains the concepts of economics and politics in engineering terms. Rose Wilder Lane wrote The Discovery of Freedom, which focused on the history of freedom going back to biblical times, and this is where she really goes into her defense of Islam and Christianity and Judaism, basically discussing this, quote, the self-directed capacity of living things to create meaning in a universe of inanimate matter. And that she ties back to God and how God gave us all free will. Okay? God, whatever God, whether it's, Odin, Islam, Odin, Allah, God, Judah, Jehovah. Whatever your name for God is, he gave you free will, and that is freedom, right? You don't have to bow to a church hierarchy. You are still free. But where Paterson and Lane's contributions are treated as nonfiction philosophy, Rand's book, The Fountainhead, was epic fiction. It celebrated excellence and individualism in the face of conformity and mediocrity. And all three ladies are hated for this. One of the books he cites in here, I actually have. It's called Prairie Fires by Carolyn Fraser. I think it's Carolyn Fraser. But she basically just blasts Lane because Lane was this horrible, awful, no good, awful, wretched libertarian who, hated people and, thought everybody should die. And I'm like, well, actually her philosophy, one of the things that drove her apart from both Paterson and Rand was her philosophy that we're all a brotherhood, right? This is a brotherhood of man. We are each other's keepers. And that concept really drove Paterson nuts. She couldn't wrap her head around it. that coupled with, and basically, I haven't read Carolyn Fraser's book yet. I have it. I think I'm going to read it next year, because you do need to read things for yourself to draw your own conclusions. But just off of what he cited, it's like, well, nobody hates an apostate more than a current communist, right? Each of them was horrified in their own way by the 1930s and 40s unfolded, and pushed back in their writing at the fascism that FDR was unfolding on America. And you can argue over the semantics of whether his policies were fascist or communist. And ultimately, it's irrelevant, because as anyone who studies history will tell you, the two ideologies are two sides of the same coin. You circle far enough around and you're going to find that they are the exact same thing. The government controls everything, and we the people are but peons to feed the government machine. I did find it interesting that he included in there that both Hitler and Mussolini thought that FDR was doing a fine job. So take that for what you will. Paterson wrote scathing commentary in her weekly columns until she left the paper in the face of the increasingly leftist bent of the paper's editors, which we see today, right? It's hard to find a paper that's not a leftist bent. Rand and Lane each testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee. One story about Lane was particularly fun to read. I hadn't heard this one before. When FDR implemented Social Security, she refused to participate. She did everything she could to keep her income below the tax threshold level so she wouldn't have to contribute or draw from it. And she went off-grid, planting her own food and trading with neighbors rather than bow to this new system that he was implementing. And then one day she heard a radio broadcast about Social Security, and she wrote a postcard to the station on which she asked why the nation was bothering to fight Germany if it was simultaneously adopting that country's policies, writing, quote, "All these Social Security laws are German, instituted by Bismarck and expanded by Hitler. Americans believe in freedom, not in being taxed for our own good and bossed by bureaucrats." This is a postcard, all right, which means you flip it over, you read it, all right? It's not a letter. It wasn't in a sealed envelope. So when the postmaster saw that, he read it, turned it over to the FBI, who then visited Lane at her home, where she promptly booted them off her property, telling them, quote, "I am an American citizen. I hire you. I pay you. And you have the insolence to question my attitude? The point is that I don't like your attitude. What is this, the Gestapo?" Now, she then published this story as a pamphlet, and it received fairly wide circulation with the National Economic Council, and the FBI even confirmed it happened. So while she tends towards fabulism, she'll like tell the tall tale, all right? It's not necessarily a strict lie, but she might stretch the truth a little bit, give it longer legs than it really has. But this one was actually confirmed by the FBI, so that's pretty funny. I mean, it's the good old days, right? When you could tell the FBI to fuck right off, and they would fuck right off for you. Hi, FBI guy. I don't know who you are. Used to be Chad. Don't know who you are now. But hi, I love you. Don't fuck right off. I don't have that many watchers. I need you to watch and, get my boost my ratings. This book was beautifully written. It was masterful. It covered the history and times. I mean, basically just a snapshot of a 40-year window of history. And it was a snapshot of 40 years. And he even explained quite succinctly why Hoover failed so spectacularly in the immediate aftermath of the stock market collapse. Bluntly, he genuinely believed that the economy could be planned and controlled. And that has proven spectacularly false in the intervening years, right? Sandefur wove together the literary influences and historical events that shaped the way these ladies thought, and clearly shows how what they in turn wrote impacted the American political scene, and eventually gave birth to the Libertarian Party, which would field its first candidate in 1972. I think Rand and Lane were still alive. I think Paterson died in the 60s. I quite enjoyed this book. It's made me want to go back and reread the Little House series. Hi, Mom, and Rand, and I am still rereading Heinlein. So hi, Dad. And I added The God and the Machine to my read pile for this year. That will be in November, and that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next Sunday. Bye.